All right, so we're back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Larry Chapp, who is a retired professor of theology and now runs a Catholic worker farm. So, first off, Larry, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. We've had some bad luck in getting this podcast off the ground, but it's finally here. So thank you.
Yes, and the passing of Pope Francis and Pope Leo now coming in kind of got in the way. I'm sure you'll tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about your
Yeah.
experience watching it all happen. But for those who are not already familiar with your work, tell us about your background. Tell us about how you ended up doing the kind of work that you do.
Well, I'm just a Midwestern boy at heart. Grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then spent several years in seminary thinking I wanted to be a priest. That didn't pan out. Then just ran off to, hey, Fordham. I know you have a Fordham connection.
Mhm.
Got my PhD in theology at Fordham University in 94. I studied all the highfalutin Germanic, systematic theology, Ratzinger, Balthasar, Rahner, all that stuff. And then, immediately got a job, 20 years, DeSales University near Allentown, PA. And during that time, back up a second. When I was in seminary, I had spent time in Latin America. In particular, I spent about a year in the Dominican Republic. And ostensibly, it was just to learn Spanish, but I was also picking up a great deal of uh, just experiences with the poor and so on, and began to really think a lot more deeply, even way back in my youth, about the church's need to really pursue the preferential option for the poor, as the liberation theologians were talking about, and that's a very real thing. And then you go back and you reread the Gospels, and you begin to see, you know what? Jesus had some harsh, harsh words for wealth and wealth accumulation. And we can mute that and we can try to soften the edges of that. But it's very clear that Jesus had a lot of negative things to say about wealth and a lot of positive things to say about embracing the poor. So once I started teaching theology, I started teaching the Catholic Church's social teaching, and not just the social encyclicals, but writing and teaching a lot about various individuals. And then eventually, I started teaching about Dorothy Day and Peter Morin and the Catholic worker movement. And I don't know why, but just about more than any other modern person involved in helping the poor and so forth, the church, she and Peter Morin really struck a nerve with me and my wife. And my wife is a PhD in theology too, and we were both we started teaching Dorothy Day, Catholic worker, but after a while, we realized that our comfortable bourgeois existence in the suburbs of Allentown, going out to eat, fancy restaurants all the time, comfortable existence, that just didn't seem to jive up with what we were teaching in the classroom. We were talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So we both eventually came to the same conclusion. Maybe it was time to do something more specifically, more radical in terms of Catholic worker. And we decided on a Catholic worker farm rather than a house of hospitality, just because it seemed to suit our personalities better. And just because you're on a farm doesn't mean you can't also continue to do hospitality. And, we took in an Eritrean woman who's a refugee with her son, and things like that. So, they're not incompatible. So here we are, 13 years later on our Catholic worker farm. And it's been a real ride.
Tell us about life on the farm. What does it actually consist of, and what is it like for you?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's somewhat misleading. We call it a farm just because that's what all Catholic worker farms are called. But in reality, almost every single Catholic worker farm that's ever been in the history of Catholic worker farms is really nothing more than a homestead. I guess what we would call, sometimes we refer to this as the Dorothy Day, Catholic worker homestead instead of farm, so that when people come here, they don't come here expecting to see some big operation, with acres and acres of crops planted and volunteers running around everywhere, harvesting this, harvesting that. And it's not. It's a small place, about 11 acres, and very quickly we discovered that growing food was not as important as we thought it was going to be. A lot of the local food pantries and soup kitchens, and even the Catholic worker houses of hospitality near us, like in New York, they're kind of flush with food. I mean, they get all kinds of donations from grocery stores and places like that that are offloading soon to expire foods that they can then write it off on their taxes, as a charitable donation. And so they're really kind of flush with food. And so we quickly discerned that the farm was going to be more a place of Benedictine spirituality and a respite and a place for people to come to experience a more agrarian lifestyle. So we have animals, and the animals are important. We have sheep, and we harvest their wool. We have dairy goats, and we milk them. We have chickens that we use for eggs, and we have what are called feeder pigs, which are pigs you buy as piglets in the spring, and then you raise them up, and then around September, October, when they're about 250 pounds, you butcher them. And we're running a food pantry in a conjunction with our parish in Scranton, and so all of the pig meat and the eggs from the chickens and the dairy goat milk, so that will go to the food pantry. And so, kind of life on the farm pretty much consists of morning chores with the animals, and we do liturgy of the hours and prayer, and then doing fellowship with visitors that show up rather frequently during the day. And that's a big part of what we do.
Hmm. So I want to get a little bit more into your initial attraction to Peter and Dorothy and the worker because, I think if you look at I don't know, if you look at things right now, there are various interpretations of their legacy. You have people who kind of paint them as these radical socialists, progressives,
Yeah.
um, and then,
Mm.
if you actually go into her work, like you see, she was a, a very pious Orthodox Catholic. Like she took the church's teaching authority very seriously. It's not to say she blindly followed everything, but she understood that there needed to be
Yeah.
this tension between freedom of conscience and the authority, the dogmatic teachings of the hierarchy. And she didn't just say, like, she didn't go for this kind of easy cop out that many people use, like, oh, but it's my conscience, so I can ignore the teachings. Like, she never did that. Um, and I mean, also though, like you see that and when it comes to personal ethics, like she really understood that what the church was saying about how we live our lives on that personal level, like it has something, it's very much correlated to our relationship with the poor. Like we have to live spiritual poverty in our own lives if we're really going to be
Oh, very much so.
inspired.
A lot of she
Well,
certainly was not a socialist in that. She had Marxist leanings. There's no doubt about it. I mean, back in the early days before her conversion, she was real bohemian, hanging out in the streets of Chicago and New York City with writers and playwrights like Eugene O'Neill and stuff, and chain smoking and drinking and carousing and hanging out with Marxist agitators and so on. But when she converts, and the conversion was the result of seeking something deeper, something more spiritual than just the superficialities of constant politicking. And once the conversion sets in, all right, she repudiates much of the Marxist sort of legacy, especially class warfare and the atheism and materialism. But nevertheless, she retained a deep, deep sympathy with the fact, as she once said, at least the Marxists are out there fighting for the poor, which is just wasn't always true of the Catholic Church. Although one of the things that caused her to embrace the Catholic Church was the church was in the midst, especially in the United States, in the forefront of, rights for labor unions and the labor movement and that kind of thing. And she was very impressed with that and the papal social encyclicals. But bottom line, though, is this is what really attracted me to her. Her insight, along with Peter Moore, long before Vatican II, and in line with other Catholic thinkers like Francis de Sales, she wanted to emphasize the universal call to holiness for everyone, laity. And as you well know, during her time, two-tiered Catholicism had emerged where you've got the spiritual athletes, your celibates, your monks, your nuns, and they were the ones who could live the evangelical counsels. The rest of the laity, we just could go the way of the commandments, which was interpreted in a kind of casuistical, minimalist way. What can I do to get away with this and get away with that and still go to communion? That kind of Catholicism with the clericalistic bifurcation, she resolutely opposed
Mm.
and said that every Catholic needs to be living the Sermon on the Mount. And she took that literally. She believed we needed to be living the Sermon on the Mount quite literally and not to spiritualize it away. So, way before her time, way before Lumen Gentium and the Second Vatican Council and the Universal Call to Holiness, what was most radical about Dorothy was her awareness that the laity need to step up to the plate and live the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And that in the tonality and register of the Sermon on the Mount, which also means that she was already sort of, in a sense, post-liberal in her thinking.
Mhm.
Um, and if a friend of mine, David Dean, theologian, says, "Man, if we think the post-liberal left is scary, just wait till you see what the post-liberal right is going to be like."
Yeah.
And I think that's very true. One of the scariest things imaginable is if in Catholicism all post-liberal thinking is co-opted by the right wing, by the conservative wing of the church, which I think is not good. There is a socialist way as well of being sort of post-liberal. Not that I'm a socialist, nor was Dorothy, but you get my point. I think that one of the significant things about Dorothy Day is that she's anticipating sort of a post-liberal order in a manner, though, that isn't just sort of paleo-conservative or, that kind of back to the landism that you sometimes see with kind of homesteady type Catholics with the beards and the tweed jackets and the pipes and the 27 kids and you know all that kind of thing. Not that I'm opposed to 27 kids, but you get my drift.
Yeah, no, but it's just interesting how historical circumstances really shape the way we perceive the church's relationship with the world. Because I mean, if you look at, yeah, when during Dorothy's time, the church in America was still trying to gain credibility into with the amongst the WASP
Yeah,
Protestant hegemony. So I think, especially like the Irish Catholic bishops, did a lot of work to try to say, hey, look, we're not that different. We're not that out there, which is part of why there is this kind of like bourgeois ethos.
yeah,
Whereas Dorothy's reading the papal encyclical, she's reading the early church fathers, and she sees like, okay, well, no, I mean the church is not really meant to align itself with capital. Like the church is saying something different, and she really witnessed to the church like what we actually teach. But then if you fast forward to the 60s, like you see that also leads to this radical kind of cultural shift where the people interested in, pacifism and serving the poor, it's often these people who are very lax when it comes to morals. When we think about the hippies. So I think that's part of why today, like a lot of people will write her off as like, oh, she's this lefty, she's this socialist, she was very progressive.
yeah.
Like, well, no, not exactly. And that's why it's interesting reading your work because I have a lot of respect for the various Catholic worker houses and farms around the world. But the reality is a lot of them, yeah, have kind of forgotten like the roots,
Yeah, they have.
the legacy of fidelity to the church, to Christ. And it's fine if, you have a different religious belief, but like I see a lot of people try to make it something that it's not. So to meet Catholic workers who really are rooted in the church in its entirety and all of its teachings is it's a relief.
It is
So,
because
yeah,
it is very, very true that there are quite a few Catholic worker houses and farms that have just succumbed to leftism,
yeah,
whatever the latest trendy issue is on the left. And, well, I'm not going to go into specific issues, but you
sure.
get the point. And that was not Dorothy Day's vision. So that was actually one of the things that we tried to do here on the farm, is to, in a sense, restore Dorothy Day's truly Catholic vision. And there are some Catholic workers out there that are also trying to do that. I know my friend Colin Miller out in Minneapolis area, St.
Yeah.
Paul area. He's trying to do that. And of course, there's the long-standing Houston Catholic worker,
Yes.
and their efforts and their works with migrants, very, very orthodox. And then, but I still hear stories, horror stories here and there of faithful Catholics who are at a Catholic worker house who are essentially persecuted right out of the house because they're not sufficiently on board with the latest cause du jour, and
Yeah. But the inverse of that is that, you have people who are more, traditional when it comes to ethics, personal ethics, and they see, these people who are rejecting the church's teachings and are living very libertine lives. They're the ones who are kind of making a fuss about poverty and capital. So we should pivot right. We should, not just on personal ethics, but on the economics, on, the state's role in our lives, which to me is a disappointment because again, the church is saying something that totally transcends this
Yeah.
contemporary American left-right binary. And this is another point that you talk about, and I want to ask you to say a little bit more now that a lot of Catholics, a lot of people of faith in general, their point of departure is the mainstream political paradigm, and then they'll sprinkle their religious beliefs on top of it, rather than starting from their religion and then kind of entering into
Yeah.
politics from there. Why do we do that? Why do we compromise our beliefs in that way?
I think it's because people tend not to want to have to think too deeply about things. And most people don't sit around reading political philosophy or theology. Their faith is largely devotional. Their faith is largely sacramental. And they haven't really thought long and hard and deeply about how living their faith should make them different
Yeah.
from the surrounding culture. Instead, most Catholics have spent most of their lives trying to figure out how can I live my Catholic faith and not be different from the surrounding culture? How can I reconcile those two things? And you see that phenomena on both the left and the right. And
Yes.
so you end up adopting either a leftist political vision or a rightist political vision, and then you in a sense compromise your faith by adjusting it to that reality. It's just easier, it's simpler. It's a way of not having to be countercultural, which is difficult. It's also a way of not having to think rather deeply
Mm.
about these things and to educate yourself and to learn. So, our whole culture is geared towards, especially now with the digital age, it's geared towards a rather ephemeral and superficial uh, form of existence. There is a general lack of existen. I hate to use a cliche term, but a general lack of existential spiritual authenticity
Mm.
in so many people. It's what I struggle against myself. I'm infected with this bacillus, the bacillus of modernity, and its superficialities. Oh yeah, I struggle against it all the time. So I'm a leper talking to other lepers when I say these things. I don't say it judgmentally at all. It's hard to be an American living in American culture and to live the Dorothy Day vision and the Sermon on the Mount and to not let the political tail wag the Christological dog.
Yeah, but what do you say to people who think, I mean, obviously my religion teaches something very different from the mainstream kind of American Democrat Republican
Yeah.
binary, but it wouldn't be realistic for me to try to forge some kind of alternative or like, you have the American Solidarity Party, which, their platform is much
Eh.
more reflects the Catholic Church's social teaching, but they're not going to win the presidential election. So what do you say to those people who are like, yeah, but we got to be realists here. We got to support the Democrats or the
Well,
Republicans?
I don't mind if people want to
Yeah.
support Democrats or Republicans. I myself, I'm like Dorothy Day. I don't vote.
Yeah.
And I don't vote because I consider voting to be a form of complicity in an immoral order. People don't even begin to fathom how deeply I think the United States of America is one of the most evil regimes ever to grace this planet. And that's just me. But see, that's my personal political point of view. And people are shocked when they hear me say things like that. But if other people still believe in the American experiment in democracy, as I like to say, and so they're going to vote left or they're going to vote right, fine, fine. Trump, Biden, that's fine because there are penultimate goals that you might have in mind,
Right.
short of eternity. You might say, well, I'm voting for the Democrats because I'd like to see socialized medicine someday, or I'm voting for the Republicans because I don't want to see socialized medicine. And those are all legitimate things. That's a
Yeah.
legitimate thing to do. The thing is, don't put your trust in chariots. Don't begin to start to conflate the kingdom of God with that. I mean, I remember in 2008, I was in London and I was walking in the streets of London, and Obama had just been elected. It was election day in America, and Obama and Londoners who knew I was an American were running up to me, and they were so euphoric, and it was almost as if America had just elected the Messiah. It was like Jesus Christ has returned, and his name was Barack Obama.
Yeah.
And I turned to the guy I was with, and I said, "This is really telling, isn't it? This is shows how eschatological our politics have
Yeah.
become, how messianic they've become." And I say, yeah, vote for whoever you want to vote for, but just don't invest eschatological, messianic, apocalyptic tonality into any of it, and just realize that whatever goals are, they're going to be marginal and penultimate rather than earth-shaking and world-shattering.
There's the difference between, like you said, putting your trust, putting your faith in whichever party versus, doing it as doing it as a compromise because, choosing the lesser of two evils. But I see too many people who really believe like, no, this platform is really great and it's, they allow it to define their worldview, whereas it says, no, I mean, you might do it as a necessary evil, but clearly I mean, if you really take your religion, whatever, most religions seriously, you'll see like this doesn't fit this paradigm. Um, so, I mean, now I want to move on to just the state of the American church, which again, I think is too much, like the discourse within our church is too much influenced by the kind of political paradigm that we find ourselves
Yeah.
in. And I'm often very refreshed when I meet Catholics from other countries who are not kind of contaminated by that mode of thinking. But it's obviously very interesting having an American Pope now. And I mean, you were there to see all this
Yeah.
happen. Um, what do you see as I don't know, what do you think can happen? What do you think are the possibilities with Pope Leo the 14th, especially given the name that he chose, Leo? What do
Well,
you
he's only been Pope, what, a couple months now.
sure.
And I think the choice of name is a stroke of genius for
Yes.
starters. Let's put it that way, because had he chosen to be called Pius the 13th or John the 24th, Paul the 7th, John Paul the 3rd, Benedict the 17th, Francis the 2nd, every single one of those choices is freighted with baggage of theological, political, ecclesiological baggage. You know, oh, he's going to be like Pius. Oh, he's going to be another Paul the Sixth, Vatican II. Oh, another Frank. No, no. He goes beyond the 20th century, all the way back to the late 19th century, and he chooses Pope Leo. And Pope Leo, a pope known for two things, not just his longevity, all right, but he's obviously the rerum novarum, the in a sense the introduction of modern Catholic social thought. But people tend to forget he was also the pope that engaged in a revival of Thomism and Thomistic philosophy in the church. And his reasons for doing so are instructive because he wanted the Catholic Church to be more vibrantly engaged in the intellectual debates of the day. And he thought that Thomism and a reinvigoration of Thomism was going to be the way to do that. But that opened the doors to intellectual discourse that became known as ressourcement theology, communio theology, that led to the Second Vatican Council and people like Joseph Ratzinger and Henry de Lubac and Jean Danielou, Romano Guardini, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Louis Bouillet, the list goes on and on and on.
Mhm.
And that legacy is powerful. So I think in choosing Leo and bypassing all of the political ramifications of the names of modern popes, I think what he's saying is we need to go back to our roots. Let's get back, let's unify the church by getting back to what is most essential. What is most essential in the church today? And to that end, he keeps talking about Christ. And Dorothy Day was a very Christocentric thinker, and so is Pope Leo. So I think this is very, very, very important. What's going to happen in the American Catholic Church? I don't know. It's going to be interesting. Surely, at some point, Pope Leo will visit the United States. And when that happens, that's going to be quite a visit. I mean, I'm sure he'll go to Chicago
Yeah.
and wow the people of Chicago, but I'm sure he'll go to places like New York and
Mhm.
Philadelphia, Houston, I don't know, Los Angeles, and do a sort of American tour. If he does, I think it will have a powerful, energizing effect on the American Catholic Church. And I think it's something that the American Catholic Church needs right now is a kind of energizing because right now it's kind of very polarized. So anyway, I think that you might see a surge in religious vocations to the priesthood too.
Yeah, we can pray for that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean him choosing the name Leo. I mean, what's the thing that's most interesting to me about Rerum Novarum is precisely what we were just saying, that the Pope Leo, was not trying to take a kind of reactionary stance nor accommodationist stance to the kind of political economic paradigms during that era. He said, let's really look at what's going on. We have capitalism, we have the Industrial Revolution, we have Marx who's trying to propose an alternative. What does the church really have to say? What does Christ have to say to this reality and these different answers people are proposing? And really engaged all of them very seriously and offered something new and genuinely Catholic, something genuinely Christocentric. And I think this is exactly what, especially the US, what the whole church needs to say, okay, like let's look at what people are talking about today. Let's look at the options, and then let's really offer something that's true to who we are and what we believe, what we've experienced in the church.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
hopeful. I'm hopeful, especially for the US. But I also just, yeah, I also hope that people will rediscover Rerum Novarum and Pope Leo's the 13th
No,
lecture.
that's my hope too. I hope that it causes people to go back and say, let's begin with Rerum Novarum and let's reread all of the papal social encyclicals that followed after that. Even I think one of the best ones is John Paul II's Centesimus Annus. I think it's a
Yeah,
beautiful document
yeah,
that should not be read the way that it has been read, I think, in a sort of neocon
yeah.
way. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think applies not just to the social encyclicals, but to many papal documents in general that a lot of us like to read in. Like we look for confirmation bias. Like we try to read like, okay, what is he saying that's going to
yes.
confirm my worldview rather than how can the Spirit use this text, use what the Pope is saying to convert me, to change my worldview and the way that I live. I think I mean, we all are susceptible to doing that, but we need to be
Oh my
corrected.
goodness.
Yeah.
How the world would be changed, Stephen, if we actually all adopted that mentality, which is I'm going to read the scriptures. I'm going to read this papal encyclical. I'm going to read this great writing from, say, Francis de Sales or Gregory of Nyssa, and I'm going to see how it can change my life.
Mm.
I'm going to submit my mind to this document to see how I can perhaps be corrected, changed,
Yeah.
uplifted, rather than reading into everything, whatever the ideological baggage is that we bring to bear. I mean, how many of us? I'm guilty of this. I'll
Yeah.
pick up a book to read it with an eye towards how can this service my agenda? Can I mine this book for little nuggets for that can that well and okay, you can call it an agenda or you can simply say I have a theological point of view and I want to see how this, works with it. On the other hand, there is a tendency to not let a text speak for itself
Yeah.
from all of us. And boy, 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 boy. And I think therefore Dorothy Day was a master of letting a text speak to her and to her soul.
Yeah. And I think this is something I see a lot in her diaries, that she emphasizes how much life in community constantly reminds us to look at everything, whether we're reading a text, whether we're working with people, doing a job, to look at them with this question of how am I being called to conversion, not how can I impose or get what I want out of it. Without
And
community, it's so easy
yeah, and
to do that.
serving the poor does the same
Yes.
thing.
Yeah.
Because as you read, when you talked about her diaries, this really one of the things that really leaps out to me whenever I read anything that she wrote. Boy, she did not have rose-colored glasses
No.
about what the poor are like and working with the poor. And I've worked in soup kitchens. I've worked with the poor. I've and the fact is, your eyes get opened very very quickly that the poor are not more morally noble than other people just because they're poor. In fact, one of the downsides to poverty, especially the kind of poverty that we call destitution, that it actually creates moral deficits within you.
Yeah.
It creates hostilities and hatreds and resentments. It leads to addictions. It leads to self-destructive behavior because it has led to despair and depression and all the way we seek to self-medicate our way out of despair and depression. And so you become very aware very quickly that serving the poor means a real crucifixion, a real sacrificing of any sense of feedback or fulfillment or inner joy you're going to feel. You have to do it because you love that human being for who they are and realizing this is not going to be an easy task.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing you see in her diary is that she's just super frank about the difficult experiences with the poor living in community. And for me, there's something very refreshing about the fact that she's like she doesn't freak out when conflicts arise. She has this like she'll say like, yeah, like this was really annoying. This person, really terrified me or made me angry.
Yeah.
But she's full of this trust. Like, okay, but Christ allows this to happen. He's trying to show me something. So yeah, it's annoying, it sucks, but I'm not gonna have a meltdown. I think it's something we all can learn. But again, it's the more we are tapped into a communal setting,
Yeah.
like it's easier. So just to wrap things up, I want to ask you, for those of us who don't live at a Catholic worker farm or at a Catholic worker house, what's something that you think all of us could learn or could implement from the life that you live within a Catholic worker community? What's something that's applicable to everyday people?
I would say to make sure that you simplify your life,
Mm,
declutter it, which sometimes means getting rid of possessions, but sometimes not. But to simplify your life and declutter it so that you have time for contemplation and prayer.
mhm,
And once you have time for contemplation and prayer, you begin to be transformed within. And then in prayer, it leads you to a sense of what action, what praxis really needs to be done. Peter Morn referred to this as a sort of clarification of thought.
mhm,
Other saints have called it other things. And Dorothy mentions it in her diaries as well. Every saint talks about it, that you can only reach a sense of what God's will is in your life when in a sense you retrench, you retract, you back up, you simplify. And I just can't emphasize enough. Simplify, 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 streamline so that you have time for prayer. You have time for Lectio Divina. You have time for reading. You have time for contemplation. Because ultimately, as human beings, made in the image and likeness of God, our ultimate vocation is simply to praise and worship God. And so if we don't have time to praise and worship God here, now, I don't mean just in church, I mean contemplatively, internally in ourselves, there isn't a vocation on this thing, on this earth, or a job that we have that will be, in a sense, fulfilling to us. So we'll always be looking for something else.
yeah, amen. I think we all could benefit from that very much. So yeah, and before we go, anything that you want to plug to our listeners, anything they should check out?
Well, just go to my blog,
Mm,
gaudium22.com. The blog is obviously named after a Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, and section 22 is a famous line that's only in light of the incarnation. The mystery of the incarnation does the mystery of man take on light.
mm.
So, in other words, it's Christological anthropology. If we want to know what a human being is, look to Christ. He who sees me sees the Father, and so on. And thereby we know who we are. So, yeah, go to my blog, gaudiumetsπes22.com.
Great. Well, Larry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been great, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Awesome.